There were 9 people in my living room the day my husband's family sat me down to tell me to leave. My mother-in-law, Margaret, sat in the center of my own sofa like it was a throne she'd always owned. Around her, the whole Sinclair clan, the aunts, the cousins, the family attorney with his leather folio. My husband, Julian, stood by the fireplace with his arm around a woman I'd never formally met but knew by name. Bianca, 26 years old, 7 months pregnant, wearing, I noticed, one of my dead father-in-law's antique brooches pinned to her dress, a family heirloom that Margaret must have already handed down to the woman she'd decided was the real Sinclair wife. Margaret folded her hands and delivered the sentence they'd all clearly rehearsed. "Vivian, dear, let's be adults about this. You married into this family. You are not of this family. Julian and Bianca are starting a real Sinclair family now. A child is coming, and it's time for you to step aside gracefully. We've had Robert draw up the papers. You sign, you take a small settlement, and you go. No scene, no drama. It's cleaner for everyone." Behind her, Julian had the decency to look at the floor. Bianca did not. Bianca looked right at me and rested a hand on her belly and smiled. I sat in the armchair across from all of them, in the house I was being evicted from, and I did not cry. I did not beg. I looked at that leather folio full of papers designed to make me disappear, and I felt something my father-in-law had planted in me 18 months before he died rise up warm and steady in my chest. Because there was one thing 9 Sinclairs in that room did not know. Harold Sinclair, Julian's father, the man who built everything they were sitting on, had spent the last year of his life making very sure that when this exact day came, the family fortune they were about to use to crush me would answer to me. They thought they'd gathered to throw me out. They had no idea they'd gathered to find out who they'd been working for. Let me take you back. My name is Vivian. I married into money I was never allowed to forget I hadn't been born into. The Sinclairs were the kind of old, cold wealth that treats warmth as a character flaw. When Julian brought me home, a scholarship girl, a nobody, a woman who'd put herself through school waiting tables, his mother Margaret looked at me the way you'd look at something tracked in on a shoe. I spent 8 years being tolerated, corrected, reminded, in 1,000 small ways, that I was a guest in their world, and my invitation could be revoked. I told myself it didn't matter, because Julian loved me, and for a while, in his weak and charming way, I think he did. But a man raised by cold people is a man who will, when tested, always choose the warmth of his own comfort over the warmth of the person beside him. I just didn't know yet how badly he'd fail that test. There was only one Sinclair who ever treated me like a human being. Harold, Julian's father, the patriarch, the man who'd built the family company from nothing, and who, I came to understand, quietly despised what his money had done to his own children. Harold and I had a strange, real friendship from the day we met. 2 outsiders, in a way, since he'd been born poor too, before the fortune. He saw me, and when he got sick, everything about who these people really were finally showed itself in the light. Harold's illness was long and cruel, and it lasted almost 2 years. And here is the thing I will never forget, the thing that explains everything that came after. During those 2 years, I was the only one who showed up. The rest of the family loved Harold's money and tolerated Harold. As he declined, as he became less a patriarch to manage and more an old man who needed help to the bathroom, they visited less and less. Margaret found the sick room depressing. Julian was always traveling, always busy, always sending flowers instead of coming. The aunts and cousins circled the estate lawyer more than they circled the actual man. But I came. Every day. I wasn't working. The Sinclairs hadn't permitted their son's wife to have a career. So I had the time, and more than the time, I had the want. I sat with Harold. I read to him. I learned how he took his tea, how to make him laugh when the pain was bad, how to be a person in a room with a dying man instead of a mourner in waiting. And one afternoon near the end, lucid and quiet, Harold took my hand and said the thing that would echo through the rest of my life. "Vivian," he said, "you know what I've learned, watching them all wait for me to die. The ones who show up when there's nothing to gain are the only ones worth a damn. Everyone in this family is very kind to me now that I have something they want. You're the only one who was kind to me, when all I had left to give was my bad moods at the end of a long day." He squeezed my hand with what little strength he had. "I'm not as gone as they think, and I've made some arrangements. When the time comes, you remember. I saw you. I saw exactly who you are, and I saw exactly who they are too. I thought he was just a dying man being sentimental. I had no idea he'd been sitting up at night with his real lawyer, not the family's lawyer, his own, quietly rewriting the architecture of everything. Harold died on a gray morning in March with my hand in his, and none of his blood relatives in the room. They arrived within the hour, though, for the will. The reading was a decoy, though I didn't understand that yet. The public will divided the obvious things, the houses, the art, generous sums, mostly along the lines everyone expected, with a modest, almost insulting bequest to me that made Margaret visibly relax. Good, I could see her thinking. The scholarship girl got her little envelope, now she'll drift away. What the reading did not mention, what almost no one in that family understood existed, was the Sinclair Holdings Trust, the actual engine, the controlling entity that held the family company, the majority of the real wealth, the thing all the houses and art were just ornaments hanging off of. Harold had restructured it in his final year, and he had named a single successor trustee to control it. He hadn't told me. He'd only told me to remember that he saw me. So after he died, and the family collectively decided I'd served my purpose, and the coldness came back in full, I grieved the only Sinclair who'd ever loved me, and I quietly began to drift toward the exit they were all clearly holding open for me. And that's when Julian showed me who he really was. I found out about Bianca the way I found out about everything in that family, last, and by accident. She'd started as his assistant. Then she was at every event, standing a little too close. Then Julian was working late, with a frequency that would have embarrassed a soap opera. I confronted him once, gently, giving him the chance to lie well, and he didn't even bother. He just looked at me with a new coldness. Harold's death had cut the last thread of decency in him, and said, "Vivian, let's not pretend this was ever going to last. You were a phase. Bianca is appropriate. Appropriate, meaning born into the right kind of money, meaning approved by Margaret." Then it escalated fast and cruelly. Within 2 months, Bianca was pregnant. Within 3, Julian informed me, in my own kitchen, that Bianca would be spending more time at the house because she was carrying the Sinclair heir and needed to be somewhere appropriate. He moved his pregnant mistress into our home while I was still living in it. Margaret gave Bianca my late father-in-law's brooch. The family began referring to Bianca, at dinners I was still absurdly expected to attend, as the mother of Julian's child, as though I were already gone. They were erasing me while I stood there, confident, coordinated, certain that a scholarship girl with a small inheritance and no family of her own would take the settlement and vanish, because what else could someone like me possibly do against people like them? I let them think that, because I'd started, quietly, to go through Harold's things. It began with a box. Harold had left me one personal box. The family had sneered at it, a few old books and papers, beneath their interest. But inside, tucked into a book he knew I loved because I'd read it to him, was a sealed letter in his handwriting and a business card for a lawyer I'd never heard of, not the family's firm, his own, a number, and 3 words in Harold's hand, "When you're ready." I wasn't ready for a while. Grief makes you slow. But the day Bianca wore that brooch in my living room, something in me got very still and very clear, and I called the number. The lawyer, an old associate of Harold's, confirmed what the letter had begun to tell me. Harold had named me successor trustee of the Sinclair Holdings Trust, not a beneficiary of a modest envelope. The trustee of the entity that controlled the company, the majority of the fortune, and, critically, the family's access to all of it. Harold had built a fortress and handed me the only key, and told no one, because he knew that the moment the family found out, they would spend every resource they had trying to break it before it could take effect. But it had taken effect, quietly, months ago, while Margaret was handing my father-in-law's heirloom to my husband's pregnant mistress. The entire Sinclair fortune was already, legally, answering to me. And then I found the second thing, the thing that turned a divorce into a criminal case. Because I now had a reason to look closely at the trust's accounts, I looked closely, and I saw that money had begun to move. Someone had been quietly draining assets from a Sinclair holding company, moving them offshore, through a shell structure, in the months since Harold's death. Someone with insider access who'd assumed no one was watching the books closely, because no one was supposed to know the books had a new master. The transfers were sophisticated, layered, designed to vanish money past the reach of any future divorce, or any nosy trustee. Julian. Julian was looting the family company, hiding the money offshore, preparing to walk away rich and clean with Bianca, while I got a settlement calculated to look generous and be nothing. I didn't understand the mechanics well enough to fight it alone, but I knew someone would. A woman I'd met once at a charity lunch, who'd survived her own war with a powerful family, had pressed a name into my hand and said, "If it ever gets bad, she's the one you want. Quiet, sharp, doesn't lose." So I made an appointment with an attorney named Diane Okafor. Diane listened to the whole thing without a flicker. The marriage, the mistress, the eviction they were planning, Harold, the trust, the offshore transfers. When I finished, she asked me to walk her through the structure of those transfers in detail. The shell company, the routing, the specific way the money disappeared. And as I described it, I watched Diane Okafor go very, very still. "Vivian," she said carefully, "I need you to show me those transaction records. All of them." I did. She read for a long time in silence. Then she took off her glasses and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, something between triumph and old banked anger. "I'm going to tell you two things," she said. "The first is about your situation, and it's very good news. The second is about something much bigger, and I've been waiting 3 years to say it out loud. The first thing, you are the successor trustee. That means your husband has been embezzling from a trust you control. He's not hiding marital assets from you. He's committing fraud and breach of fiduciary duty against an entity you are the legal master of. He didn't just cheat on you, Vivian. He committed a crime, and by pure poetic justice, the victim of that crime, the person with legal standing to freeze every cent and put him in a courtroom, is you. They're planning to evict you from a house that answers to a trust you run. Let them hold their little meeting, let them hand you the papers, and then let me tell you exactly what to say." She leaned forward for the second thing, and her voice dropped. The way that money was moved, the shell structure, the routing, the specific fingerprint of it. She tapped the records. "I have seen this exact method 3 times before. 3 husbands who tried to disappear their family's money. There's a man who sells this, who teaches it, who builds these structures for a fee. I've been chasing his shadow for years and never had a live one. But your husband didn't build this himself, Vivian. He hired it, which means somewhere in these records, or in your husband's phone, is the first real thread to the man I've been hunting." She almost smiled. "You came here to save your home. You may have just handed me the whole network." I held that secret for 3 weeks, and they were the hardest and strangest weeks of my life. Because now I knew. I knew that the house they were evicting me from was mine to control. I knew that the fortune they were wielding was mine to freeze. I knew that my husband was a criminal, and I was the victim with the power, and I had to walk around inside their cruelty, wearing the face of a defeated woman, because Diane was clear, say nothing until the room is full. So I let Margaret condescend to me at dinners. I let Bianca wear the brooch and rest her hand on her belly and smile. I let Julian avoid my eyes and plan his clean escape. I let them schedule the family meeting, the eviction, the papers, the graceful exit. I even let them believe I might cry. Every night I sat alone in Harold's study, in the house he'd made sure I would control, and I felt him there. The ones who show up when there's nothing to gain are the only ones worth a damn. He'd known. He'd known exactly what his son would do, exactly who his wife would side with, exactly how they'd treat the scholarship girl once he was gone. And from beyond the grave, with nothing but paper and foresight, he'd made sure I'd be standing when the dust cleared. The hardest night came a week before the meeting, when I overheard Margaret and Julian in the kitchen, not knowing I was near. Margaret was reassuring him. "Once she's gone and the divorce is clean, we move everything into the new structure. and there's nothing the little nobody can ever do about it. Your father, God rest him, was sentimental about her, but sentiment doesn't hold up a family. Blood does. And Julian laughed, agreeing, and I stood in the dark hallway with my heart pounding, holding onto the doorframe, and I did not make a sound, because I finally understood that Harold had heard that exact conversation, in some form, 100 times in his life, and had decided, quietly, to bet everything on the nobody instead of the blood. Which brings us back to 9 Sinclairs in my living room, and a leather folio full of papers, and Bianca's hand on her belly, and Margaret telling me to sign and go. "You've had Robert draw up the papers," I said pleasantly, nodding at the family attorney. "May I see them?" Margaret, gracious in victory, had Robert hand them over. I read them slowly. A divorce settlement, a modest sum, a confidentiality clause, my complete removal from the house, the family, and any claim to anything. Everyone in that room watched me read my own erasure, and the anticipation in the air was almost pleasant to them. They were enjoying this. I set the papers down on the coffee table, folded my hands, and I said, "Before I sign anything, there's a small housekeeping matter. It's about the Sinclair Holdings Trust." I watched Robert the attorney frown. Margaret didn't even know what the trust was. It had never concerned her. The money had always simply been there. When Harold restructured his estate in his final year, I said, he named a successor trustee to control Sinclair Holdings, the company, and the majority of the family's assets. He did this quietly, through his own counsel, and it took legal effect some months ago. I let the silence stretch. The successor trustee he named was me. The room's temperature dropped 10 degrees. Robert the attorney went pale, because Robert the attorney was the only other person in that room who understood what those words meant. He started shuffling through his folio as if he could find a paper that would make it not true. That's not possible," Margaret said. "Harold would never—" "Harold did," I said, "because Harold, unlike the rest of you, actually spent time with Harold. Call your own firm, have them pull the trust instrument. I'll wait." They called. We waited, and I watched the faces around that room change, one by one, as reality arrived. But I wasn't finished, because the trust was the reversal. The next part was the reckoning. I turned to Julian, who had gone the specific gray of a man watching a trapdoor open under his feet. "While we're doing housekeeping," I said, "as trustee, I've been reviewing the holdings accounts, and I've found that a significant sum has been moved offshore over the last several months, through a shell company, by someone with insider access. I let that sit in the room. That's not a divorce matter, Julian. That's embezzlement from a trust, breach of fiduciary duty, wire fraud, most likely, and the legal victim of those crimes, the one entity withstanding to press them, is the trust." I smiled. "Which is me." Bianca's hand came off her belly. She was looking at Julian now, and the smile was entirely gone, replaced by the dawning horror of a woman who'd hitched her future to a man who was about to be indicted. "You have no proof," Julian said, but his voice had no floor under it. "I have every transfer, every date, every account," I said. "My attorney has copies, so does, as of this morning, the appropriate authority." I stood up. I picked up the divorce papers off the coffee table, and I tore them, once, cleanly, in half, and set them back down. "I won't be signing these, but you should all start thinking very hard about your own lawyers. Not Robert. Robert works for the trust now, which means Robert works for me." Margaret Sinclair, who had spent 8 years looking at me like something on her shoe, opened her mouth and found nothing in it. It came apart for them the way rot always does, once you finally open the wall. Julian's embezzlement, once handed to the authorities with the trustees' full cooperation, was not survivable. A man who steals from a trust leaves a paper trail as long as his arm, and Julian had been arrogant and sloppy, certain no one was watching. He was charged. The clean, rich escape he'd planned with Bianca became a criminal defense he could barely afford, because the fortune he'd meant to flee with was frozen, by me. Bianca, it turned out, was far less interested in Julian facing indictment than in Julian facing a beach, and she was gone before the first hearing, taking the brooch, which honestly she was welcome to. Margaret and the rest of the family discovered, all at once, that every comfort they'd taken for granted, the houses, the accounts, the allowances that flowed from Sinclair Holdings, now flowed through a trust controlled by the scholarship girl they'd tried to evict. I did not throw them into the street, though I could have. I am not Margaret, but the power in that family moved, permanently and completely, from the woman on my sofa to the woman in the armchair, and everyone in it knew it. I kept the house. I kept Harold's study. I sit in it sometimes and thank him, out loud, like a fool, because he saw me when no one else did, and he protected me with the only weapon that outlives a person, foresight, written down. The ones who show up when there's nothing to gain are the only ones worth a damn. He was right. He was right about me, and he was right about all of them. There's a last piece, and it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to Diane, and to something much bigger than one cold family. Weeks later, in her office, signing the final trust paperwork, I asked Diane what had come of the transfer records, the fingerprint she'd recognized, the man she'd been hunting. She slid a single sheet of paper across the desk, face down, and rested her hand on it a moment before she let me see it. "Your husband was sloppy in one very useful way," she said. "He kept in contact with the man who built his offshore structure, and for the first time in 3 years, I have a name to go with the fingerprint, a real one, and a place." She finally lifted her hand. I read the name on the page. It meant nothing to me, but it clearly meant everything to Diane, because when I looked up, the calm, unshakable woman I'd come to rely on had tears standing in her eyes, not sad ones, the other kind, the kind you cry when a door you've been pushing on for years, finally gives. "I've been waiting a long time to find this man," she said quietly. 3 of my clients were destroyed by what he sells. Maybe more I'll never know about. She squared the papers on her desk, and the steel came back into her voice. "But I know where he is now, and I know who's going to help me walk through his door." In her waiting room, 3 women sat, one reading, one staring calmly at nothing, one holding a folder to her chest like it was the only thing keeping her upright, a new one, at the beginning of her own worst year, all of them wearing that stillness I knew now from the inside, the stillness of women who were told they were nothing, and decided, very quietly, otherwise. "You'd be surprised how many of us there are," Diane said, following my gaze the way she must have said it to each of them once. Then she looked back down at the name on the page, and something in the room changed, sharpened, aimed. "And now," she said, "we go and find him,